In the small Massachusetts village of Braintree, long before the fires of revolution burned, a boy was born who would one day argue with kings and outwit philosophers. His name was John Adams, and from the very beginning, he was not built for silence. The Adams farmhouse stood on a slope of uneven land, sturdy, simple, and unpretentious, much like the family who lived within. His father, Deacon John Adams Sr., was a farmer and cobbler, a man of God and hard labor. His mother, Susanna Boylston Adams, came from a family of thinkers and merchants. Together they gave young John two inheritances, the habit of work and the hunger for ideas. From his earliest days, Adams was restless. He was clever but stubborn, curious but easily angered. He once admitted in a letter, decades later, that as a boy, he longed for distinction, though he did not yet know what kind. He walked the fields reciting Latin verses, his hands dirty with soil, but his mind already chasing Cicero and Aristotle. At 16, he earned a scholarship to Harvard College, where his sharpness quickly made him both admired and feared. Harvard in the 1570s was a cradle of theology and order. Adams arrived like a spark among dry leaves. He devoured books on law, science, and politics, often arguing so fiercely that professors would sigh when he raised his hand. But he also learned self-discipline. Every man, he wrote, ought to examine his own soul as often as he trims his lamp. After graduation, he returned home uncertain. The ministry seemed noble but too pious for his fiery spirit. Teaching bored him. Then one day, while visiting a local court, he watched a lawyer defend a poor farmer against a rich merchant, and win, not by power, but by reason. It was a revelation. The law, Adams realized, is where truth and justice wrestle. From that moment, his path was set. He studied law under the brilliant yet controversial James Putnam, who introduced him to the works of English jurists and philosophers. Adams became obsessed with the tension between authority and liberty, monarchy and the rights of man. Yet as he absorbed English law, he found himself questioning its morality. Britain ruled its colonies not by consent, but by decree. If the king is the father, he has grown too fond of his whip. By the early 1760s, Adams had become one of the most respected young lawyers in Massachusetts. But respect was not what defined him, it was defiance. When the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765, taxing legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards, Adams was among the first to call it tyranny. He wrote fiery essays under pseudonyms like Humphrey Plowjogger, blending satire and logic to ridicule royal authority. His words spread through the colonies like sparks caught in dry grass. Yet for all his boldness, Adams was no reckless rebel. He believed in law, not mob violence. When crowds in Boston destroyed the property of tax collectors, he denounced them. Liberty, he said, must be defended by reason, not rage. This devotion to principle, to justice over popularity, would become both his greatness and his curse. It was during this turbulent time that he met Abigail Smith, a woman whose mind was as sharp as her wit. She was the daughter of a minister, educated far beyond most women of her age. Their letters, which survive today, reveal a partnership built not on flattery, but on intellectual equality. Abigail challenged his ideas, softened his temper, and grounded his ambition. "You are my dearest friend, and the one in whom my soul confides." Together, they would weather revolutions both public and private. The world, meanwhile, was changing faster than either of them could have imagined. British troops were arriving in the colonies. Taxes piled high. Boston boiled with discontent. Adams, now in his 30s, found himself caught between duty and rebellion. He knew the cost of defying the crown: imprisonment, ruin, and even death. Yet he also knew that silence was a form of surrender. In the winter of 1765, standing before a crowd of angry citizens in a candlelit tavern, Adams raised his voice. The people of this province are not the vassals of any man. The law is not a weapon for the powerful, but a shield for the free." The room erupted. In that instant, John Adams, the farmer's son from Braintree, ceased to be just a lawyer. He became a voice of the American conscience. But the road ahead would demand more than courage. It would demand a heart willing to be hated, a mind unshaken by doubt, and a soul strong enough to hold the contradictions of freedom itself. For the firebrand from Braintree had no idea that one day he would help build a nation, and then, as its second president, nearly see it torn apart. The night was bitterly cold, March 5th, 1770. Boston's streets were slick with half-melted snow and resentment. For years, the city had simmered under British rule, the red-coated soldiers serving as both protectors and oppressors. Rumors, taxes, and tempers all boiled together until that night, when musket fire split the darkness. When it was over, 5 colonists lay dead, their blood pooling on King Street. The event would be branded forever as the Boston Massacre. The city exploded with rage. Pamphlets screamed of murder, mobs demanded revenge, and the Sons of Liberty, led by fiery figures like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, painted the British as monsters. Yet in the midst of this fury, one man did something unthinkable. John Adams agreed to defend the British soldiers. His decision stunned Boston. Friends begged him not to do so. Neighbors shunned him. Some even called him a traitor. But Adams stood firm. "Facts," he said, "are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." That sentence would become one of the most famous in American legal history. To Adams, the case was not about loyalty to the crown, it was about loyalty to the law. If America was to be a land of liberty, then even its enemies must be given justice. "We must be a government of reason," he told Abigail, "else we are no better than tyranny itself." The trial began in the autumn of 1770, held in a packed courtroom thick with anger and sweat. The soldiers sat pale and silent, while outside, protesters carried effigies and shouted curses. Adams stood before the jury, not as a man defending Britain, but as one defending civilization. He built his case meticulously. The soldiers had been surrounded, taunted, pelted with snowballs and ice. Someone shouted fire, but who? Chaos reigned. "We cannot," Adams declared, "substitute passion for proof." The jury deliberated for hours. When the verdict came, 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted only of manslaughter. Boston gasped, then summered. But history would remember that day differently. Adams had risked everything to prove a single principle, that justice must stand even when it is unpopular. Years later, he would write, "It was one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered to my country." Yet this act of principle carried a personal cost. His law practice suffered, his reputation wavered. In taverns, men whispered that Adams had sold his soul to the British. But in his home at Braintree, by the firelight of long evenings, Abigail reminded him why he had done it. "You have laid the foundation for a nation of laws," she said softly. "That is the greater victory." He smiled at her, weary but proud. He had no taste for popularity. What he craved was integrity. Still, beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. He could feel the colonies tightening, like a bowstring drawn too far. The British Parliament passed new taxes. Soldiers paraded through Boston streets as if they owned them. Resistance grew. secret meetings, shadow committees, and a growing whisper of independence. Adams would soon be drawn into that world, not by ambition, but by duty. He began writing essays again, this time under the name Novanglis, the New England man. His words dissected British authority with surgical precision, exposing the Crown's contradictions and the hypocrisy of its governors. His essays spread from Boston to Virginia, reaching young radicals like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. When the Boston Tea Party erupted, Adams did not throw key, but he understood the fury. He said there are times when the people must act before the law can follow. His mind was torn between two loyalties, one to order, the other to freedom. He feared anarchy more than tyranny, yet he feared tyranny most of all. As 1774 dawned, British retaliation came swift and brutal. The coercive acts, closing Boston's port, dissolving local government, crushed the colony's spirit. Yet it also united the 13 colonies as never before. For the first time, leaders from North and South, Puritan and planter, would meet to discuss a shared future. John Adams, once a solitary lawyer, would now be chosen to represent Massachusetts at a gathering in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. On the morning he departed, he stood at the door of his modest home. Abigail handed him a bundle of letters and a kiss. "Remember, great necessities call out great virtues," she said. He mounted his horse, the reins trembling in his hands. Ahead lay the unknown, a nation not yet born, a war not yet begun, and a destiny that would test every fiber of his soul. The lawyer who had defended the enemy was now on his way to defy an empire. When John Adams arrived in Philadelphia in September 1774, the air was thick with heat and history. The city hummed with clattering carriages, the smell of tar and horses, and the quiet murmur of men on the edge of rebellion. For the first time in the New World's memory, representatives from 12 colonies gathered under one roof, not as subjects of a king, but as uneasy brothers. The First Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall, a modest brick building tucked away behind chestnut trees. Inside, the men sat on hard benches, their voices echoing against wooden beams that smelled faintly of sawdust and tobacco. Among them were farmers, merchants, lawyers, and planters, some fiery, some cautious, all aware that they stood on the trembling edge of treason. Adams, dressed plainly in a brown coat, took his seat near the center. He was not the tallest nor the most graceful, but his eyes burned with restless energy. Around him sat giants: George Washington of Virginia, quiet, grave, already commanding respect; Patrick Henry, who spoke as though God himself dictated his words; John Jay, deliberate and cautious; and Samuel Adams, John's cousin, whose revolutionary zeal frightened even his friends. When the clerk called the assembly to order, silence fell like a blade. For the first time in centuries, men born under British rule were about to question it. At first, Adams held back. He listened, took notes, and studied each delegate like a lawyer reading a jury. The southern colonies were cautious, still loyal to the king, but angry at Parliament. The New Englanders, meanwhile, wanted to strike fast and hard. Between them lay mistrust and misunderstanding, the old colonial rivalries not easily forgotten. Yet when Adams finally rose to speak, his words cut through the noise like a bell. The distinctions between Virginians and New Englanders, between Northern men and Southern men, must vanish. We are not of Massachusetts or Carolina. We are Americans. The room stirred. Washington nodded. Patrick Henry's lips twitched into a smile. For the first time, someone had said it aloud: Americans. Over the following weeks, Adams worked tirelessly. He helped draft petitions to the crown, resolutions for boycotts, and letters urging unity. But as debates dragged on, he grew restless. Many delegates still hoped for reconciliation, not revolution. They believed King George III could be reasoned with, that the wounds could be healed. Adams, however, had seen too much. He wrote to Abigail, "In my soul, I know that Great Britain will never be reconciled to us except by force. We must prepare not petitions, but powder." Yet he kept his counsel, understanding that the revolution needed time and persuasion. Patience, he told himself, is the first weapon of statesmen. At night, in the dim glow of candlelight, Adams walked the cobbled streets of Philadelphia, thinking. The air smelled of smoke and sweetbread, of sweat and promise. He passed taverns where men whispered of independence and others where loyalists toasted the king. Every face seemed a question. Are we ready to become something new? The Congress eventually produced its Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting that the colonies owed allegiance to the crown, but denied Parliament's authority to tax them without consent. It was a cautious document, half protest, half plea. Adams supported it, but privately called it a step rather than a stand. When Congress adjourned, Adams mounted his horse for the long ride back to Massachusetts. The road was muddy, the journey lonely. He carried with him a journal full of notes and a heart heavy with contradictions. At home, the world had changed. Boston was under siege. British troops occupied the city, redcoats gleaming like iron against the gray New England winter. The countryside was armed and furious. Farmers drilled with muskets in frozen fields. The air smelled of gunpowder and defiance. Abigail met him at the door, her face pale but steady. "The time for words is over," she said quietly. He nodded. "The time for deeds has come." In April 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world. The British retreated under fire from farmers and blacksmiths, their arrogance burned away by musket smoke. Within weeks, the colonies erupted. Volunteers poured in, militia became armies, and the Congress, now summoned again, would have to decide whether to command that army or dissolve into fear. Adams rode south once more, through roads choked with mud and hope. This time he carried not pleas, but plans. He knew what he would argue in Philadelphia, that the colonies must unite under one banner, one army, and one commander. And deep in his heart, he already knew the name of that commander, George Washington. As he approached the city gates, the bells of Philadelphia tolled in the wind. He felt the weight of history pressing upon him, heavier than armor, sharper than fear. The time for hesitation was over. The revolution had begun. Philadelphia, June 17, 1775. The summer heat pressed down on the cobblestones like a judgment. In the hall where the Second Continental Congress convened, the air was thick, not just with humidity, but with tension. John Adams sat at his desk, ink-stained fingers clasped tightly around a quill. He could hear the murmurs around him, words like war, treason, independence, whispered as if they might summon thunder. Only months before, blood had been spilled at Lexington and Concord, and now the British Army had dug in on the heights outside Boston. The colonies were, for all practical purposes, at war. Yet the Congress, that collection of merchants, lawyers, and planters, had not yet admitted it. They still spoke of reconciliation, even as smoke rose from Massachusetts. Adams could not abide it. He stood, his small frame brimming with intensity. His eyes, bright and unflinching, swept across the room. "We must," he declared, "take up the sword in earnest. There can be no peace without freedom. His words struck the air like flint. Some delegates applauded softly, others frowned. The cautious John Dickinson of Pennsylvania whispered to a neighbor that Adams was dangerously forward. The Southern men shifted uneasily. They did not yet trust these fiery New Englanders, whose towns were already aflame. Adams knew he needed something, someone to unite them. A symbol that could bind Virginia and Massachusetts, Carolina and New York into one cause. That someone was sitting quietly across the hall, George Washington. Washington, tall and reserved, wore his military uniform, buff and blue, a reminder of his service in the last war against the French. He had said little, but his presence spoke volumes. Washington watched him carefully, weighing every gesture. Washington had dignity without pride, confidence without arrogance, the kind of man who could command not just troops, but respect. When Adams rose again to speak, he did not name Washington directly. Not yet. He began instead by describing the needs of the hour. An army, united under one command, to show the world that the colonies were one people, not scattered militias. We must appoint a general, he said, whose character will silence envy and command obedience. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Then, with deliberate calm, Adams added, "I know one such man, a gentleman from Virginia who has served his king with honor and will now serve his country with equal fidelity." All eyes turned to Washington. The Virginian shifted slightly, his face unreadable. Some gasped. Others nodded in recognition. The motion passed to the floor. Within days, George Washington was unanimously chosen Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Adams had achieved his goal, not just by brilliance, but by understanding the politics of unity. In elevating Washington, he had bound the South to the North and transformed rebellion into revolution. That evening, Adams wrote to Abigail, his heart racing. "I have this day nominated the greatest man in America for the command of our armies, and he is accepted by all. May heaven prosper him, for the fate of liberty depends upon it." Washington, upon learning of his appointment, bowed his head. He said softly, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with, but as no consideration could induce me to accept this arduous employment but that of a pure love of my country, I shall hope that my fellow citizens will hold me excused for every error." It was a moment Adams would never forget. But as the Congress rejoiced, Adams knew the real battle had only begun. The army around Boston was ill-fed, ill-clothed, and ill-trained. The treasury was empty. Gunpowder was scarce. And the colonies, those fragile alliances, were still bound by suspicion and pride. In late June, news arrived of the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British had taken the heights, but at terrible cost. Over 1,000 redcoats lay dead or wounded. The colonists, though defeated, had fought like lions. When Adams read the report, he whispered, "This is the beginning of the end of British rule in America." Still, his optimism was tempered by fear. He told a friend, "We have kindled a fire which the British cannot extinguish, and which we may not be able to control." The Congress turned to practical matters, raising money, organizing supply lines, drafting letters to foreign nations. Adams found himself at the center of it all. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, his candles burning low. He wrote in frustration, "Posterity will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve its freedom. I hope they will make good use of it." And yet, amid this chaos, Adams felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time, he was not merely a lawyer or delegate, he was helping shape a nation. He dined often with Washington before the general departed for Boston. They spoke not as politicians, but as men bound by a common purpose. Adams saw in Washington a mirror of his own discipline and restraint, though expressed in silence rather than speech. His modesty, Adams later said, was equal to his greatness. When Washington finally left Philadelphia, the streets were lined with citizens. Bells rang, children waved flags, and old men wept. Adams watched from the steps of Carpenter's Hall as Washington rode out, solemn, straight-backed, the embodiment of resolute. Beside him, another delegate murmured, "Do you think he will win?" Adams did not hesitate. He must. That night, Adams walked home alone under a purple sky. Fireflies blinked over the Delaware, and the sound of drums echoed faintly from distant camps. He felt the weight of what had begun, a rebellion too large to stop, too righteous to fail. He did not yet know that this same decision to give Washington command would one day set the two men on diverging paths, allies in principle, but adversaries in politics. For now, there was only unity and the fragile dawn of a new idea, that a people could govern themselves. And in that faith, John Adams found his purpose. By the late 1770s, John Adams had become both indispensable and uneasy, a man trapped between glory and exhaustion. The American Revolution was in full blaze, and though he was far from the battlefields, Adams's influence was felt in every dispatch, every debate, every letter sent from Philadelphia to the far corners of the colonies. While generals wielded muskets, Adams wielded arguments, sharp, unyielding, and forged in conviction. In the Continental Congress, Adams had earned the title the Atlas of Independence, for he carried the cause upon his shoulders when others faltered. He was tireless in committees, unrelenting in discussions, and often infuriating in his bluntness. Yet his fiery words gave form to the nation's soul. When he spoke, even those who disliked him felt compelled to listen. "Objects of the most stupendous magnitude," he declared, "are now depending. We must act with decision, energy, and firmness." He was no mere dreamer. He was a craftsman of freedom, hammering ideals into laws. But with every triumph came isolation. His fierce sense of integrity alienated allies and friends alike. He distrusted demagogues, disdained corruption, and spoke his mind with surgical precision. Some admired his honesty, others whispered of arrogance. Yet Adams knew the price of compromise too well. He had seen how power could rot good men. Better to be hated for principle, he believed, than loved for deceit. Then, in 1778, came the call that would change his life. Congress appointed him to travel to France as an emissary, a diplomat in the land of kings and revolutionaries. It was a cruel irony. A man who despised monarchy now sent to plead with monarchs for help. But Adams accepted. "The cause is just," he wrote to Abigail, "and if I fall in it, it will be in a good cause." He left behind his wife and children, once more, crossing the cold Atlantic in a leaky frigate, sick with seasickness, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbroken. France was a world unlike any he had known. Gilded salons, powdered wigs, whispers of scandal and intrigue. Benjamin Franklin, already beloved there, greeted him with the easy grace of a man who thrived in such company. Adams, ever rigid and severe, clashed with Franklin's charm. "He spends his time in amusement," he fumed privately, "while I am left to the drudgery of business." Their partnership, uneasy and fractious, revealed the gulf between genius and pragmatism. One sought influence through charisma, the other through precision. Still, Adams endured. He negotiated tirelessly, defended the young republic's dignity, and refused to be reduced to a mere figurehead. He was not born to flatter, but to fight. And in diplomacy, that was both his gift and his curse. Parisian society found him too stern, too blunt, too American. Yet behind their laughter, many respected his integrity. The French foreign minister, Vergennes, once said, "Monsieur Adams is not a man to be loved easily, but he is one to be trusted completely." When peace finally began to shimmer on the horizon, Adams was among those who shaped its terms. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, bore his fingerprints, a testament to his stubborn brilliance. Britain recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. The war was over. Adams had turned rebellion into legitimacy. But glory was fleeting. Even in triumph, Adams felt strangely hollow. He confessed to Abigail, "I wish that I could enjoy the laurels of my labor, but they are ever mixed with thorns." He longed for his farm, his family, the quiet dignity of work unclouded by politics. But he knew his country's birth was only the beginning, and that the real struggle, the building of a republic, was yet to come. When he finally returned to America, he was no longer the fiery lawyer from Massachusetts. He was a statesman tempered by the cold winds of Europe, carrying with him the scars of diplomacy and the certainty that the new nation's greatest battles would not be fought with muskets, but with ideas. Standing on the shores of Braintree once again, the salt wind in his hair, he could almost feel the weight of destiny pressing upon him. His service was not yet done. Ahead lay more storms, political wars, ideological betrayals, and the challenge of governing a nation drunk on its newfound freedom. John Adams, the philosopher of independence, had won a war of words and treaties. Now he would have to survive the war of power and politics, a far crueler battlefield than any he had ever known. The war had ended, but the peace was restless. When John Adams returned from Europe in 1788, America was no longer a dream, it was a delicate experiment gasping for structure. 13 states, weary and broke, drifted like islands after a storm. The war heroes had gone home, but the wounds of revolution still bled beneath the skin of the young republic. Inflation, debts, rebellion. These were not the enemies of kings, but the enemies within. Adams found his homeland changed and unfamiliar. The same Boston streets that once rang with revolutionary cries now echoed with disputes over taxes and trade. Farmers in the West, led by a war veteran named Daniel Shays, had risen up against the government itself. The sight of patriots turning on their own country chilled Adams to the core. Revolutions, he warned, are not to be made light of. They are great events, but they are not sunshine. In these turbulent years, he returned briefly to law and to the soil of his beloved Braintree. He was older now, his once dark hair streaked with gray, his manner more reflective. He cherished the quiet letters exchanged with Abigail, who had become his anchor in a world of storms. "My dearest friend," he wrote, "I must study politics and war, that our sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." Their correspondence was the thread that bound his heart to home, tender, sharp, and filled with mutual respect. But the pull of duty was relentless. In 1789, George Washington, the nation's unchallenged hero, was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. And who could serve as his second, his counselor and balance? None but John Adams, chosen by the Electoral College as the first vice president of the United States. The title sounded grand, but the role was ill-defined, a shadow of power without substance. Adams, ever the thinker, joked bitterly that the vice presidency was the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Yet behind the jest lay quiet humiliation. Once a revolutionary leader, he now found himself trapped between respect and irrelevance. Washington, noble but distant, valued Adams's intellect, yet rarely sought his counsel. Adams presided over the Senate, a chamber still learning how to govern itself. He watched as factions began to form, Federalists like himself who believed in a strong central government, and emerging Republicans like Jefferson who feared tyranny's return under a new name. To Adams, these divisions were inevitable but dangerous. There is danger that ambition and avarice will become the scourges of our new republic, he wrote. The Senate often mocked his formality, his insistence on decorum, and his belief in hierarchy. Adams believed that stability required order. His peers believed it required equality. The friction grew until he was labeled his rotundity, a cruel jest at his stout figure and old-fashioned dignity. Yet, Adams endured it with grim humor. He knew ridicule was the tax of integrity. As the new government took shape, Adams's mind turned once again to philosophy. He feared democracy without virtue, liberty without education, and freedom without restraint. Human passions are like the ocean, beautiful, vast, and dangerous. The law must be the shore that contains them. These words would come to define his political life, a belief that liberty must be guided by wisdom or it would devour itself. In the quiet moments at Mount Vernon or during long carriage rides between sessions, Washington and Adams sometimes spoke as old comrades. They shared respect, but not intimacy. Washington was marble, Adams was fire. One commanded silence, the other provoked thought. Together, they balanced the fragile infancy of a nation trying to stand on its two own legs. Abigail, ever his mirror, warned him not to let pride curdle his purpose. "Remember," she wrote, "that power, like temptation, reveals the man." He cherished her words more than any public praise. They reminded him that his true service was not to fame, but to posterity. By 1793, as Washington's first term neared its end, Adams stood at a crossroads. He had tasted power and found it hollow, yet he could not turn away. The republic was growing, restless, and divided, and he felt its pulse like a physician reading a fevered patient. He foresaw storms, partisanship, foreign entanglements, and the hunger for power that would test every ideal the revolution had proclaimed. He walked often in the garden of his Philadelphia residence, the evening wind cold against his face. The candles of the city flickered in the distance, fragile like the light of liberty itself. He thought of his children, of Abigail, of the generations to come who would never know the uncertainty of this first dawn of freedom. "I have seen liberty born, and like all newborn things, it cries before it speaks." The burden of peace had become his new war, and though his office gave him little authority, it gave him something more enduring: perspective. From that modest seat beside Washington's throne of history, John Adams began to understand that revolutions don't end when the fighting stops. They begin when a nation must learn to govern its own heart. The year was 1796, and the young republic stood on a trembling bridge between hope and division. George Washington, weary from 2 terms of leadership, announced his decision to retire, a farewell that left the nation stunned. The father of the country was stepping down, and in the vacuum of his absence, old rivalries began to stir like serpents in the grass. At the heart of that gathering storm stood John Adams. After 8 long years as vice president, he was both seasoned and scarred by proximity to power. He had watched the machinery of government grind forward, noble in intent, messy in practice. He had seen how ambition could twist patriotism, how friendship could sour in the acid of politics. And yet, despite his doubts, he still believed in the Republic's promise. Adams was the natural successor to Washington, or so it seemed. But nothing was simple in the infant democracy. His old revolutionary ally, Thomas Jefferson, now his ideological opposite, had become the standard-bearer for a rival vision, a republic of agrarian simplicity and decentralized power. Adams, a Federalist, believed in a strong government, not as tyranny, but as protection against chaos. To him, Jefferson's dream risked dissolving the nation into 13 feuding states. Their rivalry was not one of hatred, but of philosophy. Yet beneath those differences, personal resentment simmered. Jefferson's pen had subtly undermined Adams' reputation during the Washington years, while Adams viewed Jefferson's eloquence as both seductive and dangerous. They were two men who had once written Liberty's Declaration together, now preparing to duel for its interpretation. The campaign of 1796 was bitter and strange. There were no rallies, no ballots cast directly by the people. Instead, electors chosen by the states would decide. Behind the scenes, pamphlets flew like arrows, venomous, clever, and cruel. Adams was called a monarchist, accused of dreaming of crowns and titles. Jefferson was painted as an atheist and a friend of anarchy. The press, newly unleashed in its freedom, turned politics into theater. Adams, uncomfortable with such slander, refused to campaign actively. He said, "Let others seek the chair by flattery. If the office seeks me, I will serve. If not, I will still serve my country." He spent those anxious weeks walking the frosted fields of Braintree, his thoughts tangled between pride and dread. Abigail stood by him, calm as ever, her wisdom sharp as winter air. She told him, "The storm will pass, but not before it tests the strength of your keel." When the votes were finally counted, Adams prevailed, but barely. Under the strange design of the Electoral College, his rival Jefferson became vice president. Two opposing minds bound in one administration. The unity that Washington had embodied fractured overnight. He took the oath of office in March 1797, the air heavy with uncertainty. He felt the eyes of the world upon him, not just of Americans, but of monarchs and ministers across the Atlantic, watching to see if democracy could survive its first succession. Washington, standing beside him, offered a rare smile and a silent nod, a passing of the torch from legend to mortal man. But Adams knew the crown of leadership was woven with thorns. The treasury was fragile, the army small, and the seas alive with threats. France, once an ally, had turned hostile, seizing American ships and mocking its neutrality. Britain still prowled the coasts, unrepentant in its arrogance. The Republic was a pawn in the grand chessboard of empires. In his first address as president, Adams struck a careful tone. "We are a nation of laws, not of men. May reason guide us where passion would lead us astray." But reason, in politics, was often the weakest force of all. His own party, the Federalists, expected him to be a second Washington. His opponents, the Republicans, were eager to brand him as a tyrant. He stood alone, too independent for his allies, too principled for his enemies. At home, he returned each night to the comfort of letters exchanged with Abigail, who remained in Quincy, tending to their farm and family. Their words were his true cabinet, filled with candor and wit. She reminded him, "Power is but a shadow without virtue." The months that followed would test every ounce of his patience. Diplomacy with France teetered on the edge of disaster, and whispers of war filled the streets. In taverns and newspapers, his name was cursed and praised in equal measure. He felt the loneliness of command, that peculiar isolation known only to those who must decide the fate of millions. Late at night, walking the candlelit halls of the president's house in Philadelphia, Adams would pause at the window and look out at the dark city beyond.
The stars shimmered faintly above the rooftops, distant, indifferent witnesses to his turmoil. He thought of Washington's calm dignity, of Jefferson's cool intellect, of the fragile experiment entrusted to him. He whispered once to the empty room, "Liberty is not a gift we have been given. It is a burden we must prove worthy to bear." The room gave no answer, only the soft ticking of the clock, counting down the fragile hours of America's second presidency.
By 1798, the calm that John Adams had so carefully tried to preserve shattered like glass beneath the hammer of history. France, the very nation whose friendship had once secured America's independence, now treated the young republic with open contempt. Its navy prowled the Atlantic, seizing American ships, mocking the flag Adams had sworn to defend. In Paris, the revolutionary government had descended into chaos, devouring its own ideals. The world that had cheered liberty was now ruled by guillotines and generals. The scandal that ignited everything began quietly, a diplomatic insult, a whisper of arrogance. Adams had sent envoys to France to negotiate peace, but instead they were met by three shadowy agents known only as X, Y, and Z. These men demanded bribes before any discussion could begin. Tribute, they called it, as if the United States were a beggar at the gates of empire. When news of this humiliation reached home, the country exploded. Newspapers blazed with outrage. Federalists roared for war. "Millions for defense," cried one congressman, but not 1 cent for tribute. Adams felt the fire in his veins too, yet he hesitated. He had no love for France's new regime, but he feared what war might do to the fragile republic. "Great is the guilt of an unnecessary war," he warned his cabinet. Still, public anger demanded strength. He ordered the expansion of the Navy and the fortification of American ports. Ships were built with a speed that astonished Europe, sleek frigates like Constitution and Constellation, born of both pride and fear. Soon, American and French ships clashed in the Caribbean, an undeclared war historians would later call the Quasi-War. It was a strange half-war, fought in silence and salt spray. No formal declaration, no victory parades, just shadows and skirmishes between nations that had once been brothers in revolution. Adams walked a tightrope. His Federalist allies, led by Alexander Hamilton, wanted open war, believing it would strengthen the government and crush dissent. Adams, suspicious of Hamilton's hunger for power, resisted. He distrusted standing armies, he distrusted the fever of patriotism that too easily turned to tyranny. A constitution of government, once changed from freedom, can never be restored, he wrote. Meanwhile, his critics, Jefferson and the Republicans, accused him of monarchist ambitions. They saw every ship, every law, every act of defense as proof of despotism. The press, now fully weaponized, tore into his reputation with venomous precision. Caricatures depicted him as King John, crowned perched upon his wig. Adams, ever sensitive to ridicule, tried to ignore the insults, but the sting reached his heart. In this climate of fear and fury, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, granting the president power to deport foreigners deemed dangerous and punishing those who spoke against the government. Adams signed the laws reluctantly, not out of malice, but out of fear that chaos would consume the republic. Yet, it was a grave mistake. The act silenced critics, yes, but they also scarred his legacy. Printers were jailed, editors harassed, and the same liberty Adams had once defended seemed now under his boot. Abigail, ever honest, warned him gently, "My dearest friend, power can be a snare even to the most virtuous. The flame that guards may also consume." He read her words in silence and set them aside, knowing she was right, but trapped by his own sense of duty. Behind closed doors, the cabinet fractured. Hamilton schemed, Jefferson plotted, and the nation's capital became a theater of suspicion. Adams found solace only in his study, pacing by candlelight, muttering to himself about reason, justice, and the frailty of men. He was neither hero nor tyrant, but something rarer, a leader willing to stand alone even when the world called him wrong. Then, in a moment that would define his presidency, Adams made the most unpopular decision of his life. He sought peace. Against his party's fury, against Hamilton's whispers of betrayal, he sent another delegation to France, a final chance to end the madness. The gamble worked. The new French leader, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, agreed to negotiations. The war faded before it fully began. The cost, however, was immense. His own party turned against him. The Federalists called him weak. The Republicans still called him dangerous. Adams stood at the center of history's crossfire, unbowed but weary. "I have no ambition but to be right," he told Abigail. In 1800, he moved into the unfinished president's house in the swampy capital city of Washington, D.C. The walls were bare, the rooms echoing with emptiness. He wrote a prayer that night, simple and solemn. "May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." It was not the prayer of a politician, but of a father, one who had seen too much of the world's folly to believe in glory. Outside, the winds of election season gathered once more, and with them came the ghosts of friendship and rivalry. Jefferson was waiting, patient, eloquent, and vengeful. The quasi-war had ended, but Adams knew the true battle was just beginning, not for land or ships, but for the soul of the Republic itself.
The year 1800 dawned like the edge of a knife, bright, cold, and merciless. John Adams, now in his mid-60s, bore the look of a man both burdened and tempered by history. The fires of revolution had long burned out, but their smoke still lingered, curling through every chamber of government. The fragile republic he had helped to build now stood divided between two visions of America, one disciplined, cautious, and federal, the other idealistic, libertarian, and agrarian. And at the center of this storm stood Adams and Jefferson, once brothers in liberty, now adversaries in destiny. The election of 1800 was unlike anything the new nation had ever seen. It was vicious, personal, and raw, a political bloodletting disguised as democracy. Pamphlets and newspapers became weapons, words replaced bullets, but the wounds they inflicted were just as deep. Adams was called a tyrant, a monarchist, blind to the will of the people. Jefferson was denounced as an atheist, a Jacobin, a man who would drench America in the blood of another revolution. The public devoured the spectacle, as if the fate of the Republic were a form of entertainment. Adams, for his part, refused to descend into the mud. He believed too deeply in the dignity of the office, even as it turned against him. He rarely appeared in public, preferring the solitude of candlelight, reading dispatches from his cabinet or letters from Abigail. "The people are intoxicated," he wrote to her, "and when the wine of liberty ferments too long, it may turn to vinegar." Yet he never despised the people, only their impatience with wisdom. His presidency, though marked by controversy, had also brought peace and stability. The navy he built protected American trade. The war with France had ended without bloodshed. The treasury was solvent and the government stronger than before. But these triumphs were invisible to the crowd. Adams lacked Jefferson's poetry, Washington's aura, Hamilton's magnetism. His virtues, honesty, moderation, independence, were invisible in a world hungry for spectacle.
By autumn, the election raged in full fury. The Federalists split among themselves, their unity shattered by Hamilton's ambition. Hamilton, the brilliant, impetuous architect of America's finance, now turned his pen against Adams, publishing a scathing pamphlet accusing him of vanity, weakness, and temper. It was political betrayal of the cruelest kind, and it came not from his enemies, but his own camp. Adams read it in silence, his face pale, the paper trembling in his hand. "I have sacrificed too much to be wounded by vanity," he said quietly. In November, the results arrived like a slow-moving storm. Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, tied in electoral votes, sending the decision to the House of Representatives. For weeks, the nation teetered on the edge of chaos. Rumors of armed conflict spread. Whispers of coups filled the taverns. Adams, for his part, brokenhearted, refused to interfere. He could have contested the result, manipulated the process, clung to power, but he would not. "There must never be a throne in America," he told his son, John Quincy Adams, "even if it means I step down upon the scaffold of honor." In March 1801, under a gray morning sky, Adams rose before dawn. Without ceremony, without fanfare, he left the president's house. The corridors were still and cold, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the empty rooms. Outside, a thin frost coated the fields of the new Capitol. He climbed into a modest carriage bound for Quincy. Behind him, Jefferson prepared to take the oath of office, his old friend, now his successor. No trumpets sounded, no crowd cheered. The second president of the United States departed in silence. As the carriage wheels turned over the frozen mud, Adams gazed out at the bleak horizon and thought not of defeat, but of endurance. "Posterity," he murmured, "will judge more justly than our own age." When he reached his home in Quincy, Abigail waited for him at the door. She said nothing, only took his hand. That evening they sat by the fire, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and quiet reconciliation. "You have done your duty," she said softly. "That is all any man can do." In the months that followed, Adams settled into private life with the grace of a philosopher and the weariness of a soldier. He returned to his books, his farm, his correspondence. He wrote endlessly, reflections on government, religion, morality, and the fragile dance between liberty and order. Though history had turned from him, he refused bitterness. He wrote to Jefferson, "I have seen the vanity of human wishes, and I still believe that virtue is the only true wealth." Yet even in retreat, he watched the nation with anxious affection. He saw how the machinery he had helped design creaked, but did not collapse. He saw Americans argue, protest, vote, and dream, all the beautiful, messy signs of a living republic. His defeat had not been its end, but its proof. Years later, as time softened the edges of anger, Adams and Jefferson would find their way back to friendship. They wrote letters across the miles, two aging titans exchanging wisdom, memories, and jokes about mortality. "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other," Adams wrote. And they did, in hundreds of letters that became the heartbeats of a nation still finding itself. But that reconciliation lay in the future. For now, in 1801, Adams sat by the fire in Quincy, wrapped in a simple wool blanket, a cup of cider in his hand, the crackle of embers his only applause. He had lost power, but not peace. He had been forgotten by the world, but not by history. And as the snow began to fall outside, he closed his eyes and whispered the words that had guided him all his life. "To be good and to do good, this is all the religion and all the philosophy I need." The final years of John Adams' presidency and his life formed a bittersweet symphony of reflection, regret, and quiet triumph. After 4 turbulent years in office, Adams' time as the second president of the United States came to an end in 1801. Not with a grand farewell or the cheers of an adoring crowd, but with the lonely creak of a carriage leaving Washington City before dawn. He refused to attend the inauguration of his rival, Thomas Jefferson. It wasn't pride alone. It was exhaustion, the weary ache of a man who had given too much to a country still learning what freedom meant. That early morning departure through the fog and rutted roads was symbolic. Adams had entered politics to serve the Republic, not to bask in its applause. Yet now the applause had faded, and the Republic had chosen another. As the wheels turned toward Quincy, Massachusetts, Adams carried not bitterness, but a sense of tragic understanding. Democracy was not designed for comfort, and virtue was rarely rewarded in its own time. At Peacefield, his family home, the rhythm of rural life soothed the wounds left by politics. The fields outside his windows stretched toward the horizon like memories of debates in Philadelphia, letters written by candlelight, and the thundering applause of independence declared. Adams took to reading voraciously again. Cicero, Tacitus, Milton. He wrote letters filled with wit and wisdom, often to his old companion in revolution, and now his political foe, Thomas Jefferson. Those letters, exchanged over the next decade, became one of the most remarkable correspondences in human history. The two men who had once clashed over the shape of government now wrestled together with deeper questions: liberty, mortality, the fate of the human spirit. "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other," Adams once wrote, and Jefferson agreed. Through ink and parchment, they rediscovered their shared idealism. Both men had been battered by time, but their minds remained sharp, sparring, teasing, challenging. Adams' humor cut through even the weightiest topics. "I must study politics in war," he had written years before, "that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." It wasn't self-pity, but prophecy. He saw history as a relay, each generation carrying the torch a little further, never seeing the full light. Abigail Adams, his lifelong confidant, remained his anchor until her death in 1818. Her absence hollowed his days, yet he continued to write, to think, to teach his children and grandchildren the meaning of duty. To one of them he said quietly, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom." By the 1820s, the nation had grown beyond anything Adams could have imagined. The frontier pushed westward. Factories hummed. The children of the Revolution now governed a sprawling, restless republic. But Adams' mind, though confined to his farm, ranged freely across time. He pondered the paradox of liberty, how quickly it turned to chaos when untethered from virtue. He warned, there never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. And yet, he still believed the American experiment could endure if guided by reason and moral courage. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the old president lay dying. The air was still and heavy with summer heat. Outside, the village of Quincy prepared its Independence Day celebrations. Inside the Adams home, silence rolled, broken only by his labored breathing. He had lived 90 years, seen a nation born, and outlasted nearly all his contemporaries. As the light dimmed, he whispered faintly, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." He did not know that Jefferson, his friend and rival, had passed away only a few hours earlier in Virginia. Two men, bound by destiny, leaving this world on the same sacred day. A final act of poetic symmetry that no playwright could have scripted better. When news of Adam's death spread, America paused, bells tolled, orators spoke his name. He had been stern, sometimes unpopular, but now the people saw him as he truly was, a man of integrity, vision, and unyielding devotion to the Republic. At his gravesite in Quincy, the words carved into stone were simple, as he would have wished. Here lies John Adams, second President of the United States. But beneath that modest epitaph rested one of the strongest minds and most stubborn hearts the young nation had ever known. John Adams had fought not just for independence from Britain, but for independence of thought, for a government guided by reason instead of passion. His legacy was not marble monuments or great speeches, but the enduring machinery of American democracy itself. He had built the bridge between revolution and nationhood, between chaos and order, between ideal and institution. In the grand arc of history, Washington had been the father of the nation, noble and restrained. Adams was its conscience, restless, questioning, flawed, and fiercely honest. His life was proof that the Republic's strength did not come from perfection, but from perseverance. As the evening sun dipped behind the hills of Quincy, it seemed to cast a final golden light over Peacefield. Over the home where one man's fierce belief in virtue had outlasted war, rivalry, and time itself. And in that quiet glow, the story of John Adams found its rightful ending, not in triumph or defeat, but in the steady, enduring truth of service to a cause greater than oneself. The Republic lived on, and because of John Adams, it always would.
If you liked this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more great stories.